Page number 199 continued. Characteristics of Wordsworth's poetry. As Pope is our greatest poet of the town and of artificial life, so Wordsworth is our greatest poet of the country and of natural life. As an interpreter of nature, he still holds the first place unchallenged. His love of nature was boundless, and his knowledge of nature was equal to his love. He wrote always, in his own words, with his eyes steadily fixed upon his object. He wrote always, in his own words, with his eyes steadily fixed upon his object. Nothing was too small to escape his attention, and his controlling purpose was to render with absolute fidelity what he had seen. He has been called, and rightly so, the keenest-eyed of all modern poets for what is deep and essential in nature, and it has justly been said that in all his descriptions every touch is true, not the copying of a literary phrase, but the result of direct observation. Yet love, knowledge and fidelity are not after all the most specific and personal qualities in Wordsworth's nature poetry, but rather the profound religious feelings which pervades it, as he shows us again and again in many of his poems. In the lines written above the Tintern Abbey, for example, and the ode on the imitations of immortality, nature was for him the embodiment of the divine spirit. And when he insists, and this is fundamental principle in his philosophy, that nature is the greatest of all teachers, he means that between the indwelling soul of the universe and the soul of man, which is akin to it, spiritual communion is possible, through which we may gain constantly in power, peace and happiness. While, however, Wordsworth is essentially the poet of nature, he is not the less the poet of man, and in what he writes about human life, his greatness as a moralist is especially apparent. This greatness results largely from his firm hold upon the central facts of conduct and duty, and his abiding sense of the supremacy of the moral law. His emphasis is everywhere thrown upon those spiritual forces within us which give us power over ourselves and the ability, if we exercise them aright, to lift ourselves through consciousness and patient effort above the reach of circumstance and the flux of external things. The limitations of Wordsworth's genius are very obvious. He had no humor and little passion, and was singularly deficient in dramatic power. Even those who revere him most are bound to acknowledge that he wrote more uninspired and unpoetic verse than any other poet of equal rank. In his statedly philosophical poetry particularly, and notably in the Excursion, he often indulges for hundreds of lines together in prolix moralizings of the dullest and most prosaic kind. There is indeed an immense amount of perishable matter in his collected works, and beyond most great poets, therefore, he gains by judicious selection. But if what is best and really vital in his voluminous output is relatively the total bulk of it small in amount, it comprises some of the finest treasures in English poetry, and suffices to give him a high place among those of whom he himself writes. Blessings be with them and eternal praise, who gave us nobler loves and nobler cares, the poets who on earth have made us heirs of truth and pure delight by heavenly lays. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. A grief without a pang, void, dark and drear, a stifled, drowsy, unimpassioned grief, which finds no natural outlet, no relief, in word or sigh or tear. End of page 199, now page 200. In the wonderful Ode to Dejection, from which the above fragment is taken, we have a single strong impression of Coleridge's whole life, a sad, broken, tragic life, in marked contrast with the peaceful existence of his friend Wordsworth. For himself, during the greater part of his life, the poet had only grief and remorse as his portion, but for everybody else, for the audiences and that were charmed by the brilliancy of his literary lectures, for the friends who gathered about him to be inspired by his ideals and conversation, and for all his readers who found unending delight in the little volume which holds his poetry, he had and still has a cheering message, full of beauty and hope and inspiration. Such is Coleridge, a man of grief who makes the world glad. Works of Coleridge. The works of Coleridge naturally divide themselves into three classes: the poetic, the critical and the philosophical, corresponding to the early, middle and the latter periods of his career. Of his poetry, Stopford Brooke well says, "All that he did excellently might be bound up in 20 pages, but it should be bound in pure gold." His early poems show the influence of Gray and Blake, especially of the latter. When Coleridge begins his daydream with the line, "My eyes make pictures when they are shut," we recall instantly Blake's haunting song of innocence. But there is this difference between the two poets. In Blake we have only a dreamer. In Coleridge we have the rare combination of a dreamer and the profound scholar. The quality of his early poetry, with its strong suggestion of Blake, may be seen in such poems as A Daydream, The Devil's Thoughts, The Suicide's Argument, and The Wanderings of Cain. His later poems, wherein we see his imagination bridled by thought and study, but still running very freely, may best be appreciated in Kubla Khan, Christabel, and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It is difficult to criticize such poems. One can only read them and wonder at their melody and at the vague suggestions which they conjure up in the mind. Kubla Khan is a fragment painting, a gorgeous oriental dream picture such as one might see in an October sunset. The whole poem came to Coleridge one morning when he had fallen asleep over parchas, and upon awakening he began to write hastily. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-domed decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. He was interrupted after 54 lines were written, and he never finished the poem. Christabel is also a fragment which seems to have been planned as the story of a pure young girl who fell under the spell of a sorcerer in the shape of the woman Geraldine. It is full of strange melody and contains many passages of exquisite poetry, but it trembles with a strange unknown horror and so suggests the supernatural terrors of the popular hysterical novels to which we have referred. On this account, it is not wholesome reading, though one flies in the face of Swinburne and the other critics by venturing to suggest such a thing. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is Coleridge's chief contribution to the lyrical ballads of 1798 and is one of the world's masterpieces. Though it introduces the reader to a supernatural realm with a phantom ship, a crew of dead men, the overhanging curse of the albatross, the polar spirit, and the magic breeze, it nevertheless manages to create a sense of absolute reality concerning these manifest absurdities. All the mechanisms of the poem, its meter, rhyme, and melody are perfect, and some of its descriptions of the lonely sea have never been equalled. Perhaps we should say suggestions rather than descriptions, for Coleridge never describes things but makes a suggestion, always brief and always exactly right, and our own imagination instantly supplies the details. It is useless to quote fragments. One must read the entire poem if he reads nothing else of the Romantic school of poetry. Among Coleridge's shorter poems, there is a wide variety, and each reader must be left largely to follow his own taste. The beginner will do well to read a few of the early poems to which we have referred, and then try the Ode to France, Youth and Age, Dejection, Love Poems, Fears in Solitude, Religious Musings, Work Without Hope, and the glorious Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix. One exquisite little poem from the Latin, the Virgin's Cradle Hymn, and his version of Schiller's Wallenstein show Coleridge's remarkable power as a translator. The latter is one of the best poetical translations in our literature. End of page 200, now page 201. Of Coleridge's prose works, the Biographia Literaria, or Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions, his collected lectures on Shakespeare, and Aids to Reflection are the most interesting from a literary point of view. The first is an explanation and criticism of Wordsworth's theory of poetry and contains more sound sense and illuminating ideas on the general subject of poetry than any other book in our language. The lectures, as refreshing as a west wind in midsummer, are remarkable for the attempt to sweep away the arbitrary rules which for 2 centuries had stood in the way of literary criticism of Shakespeare, in order to study the works themselves. No finer analysis and appreciation of the master's genius has ever been written. In his philosophical work, Coleridge introduced the idealistic philosophy of Germany into England. He set himself in line with Berkeley and squarely against Bentham, Malthus, Mill, and the other materialistic tendencies which were and still are the bane of English philosophy. The Aids to Reflection is Coleridge's most profound work, but is more interesting to the student of religion and philosophy than to the readers of literature. Coleridge's imagination. The Romantic movement can be correctly interpreted as the revolt of imagination against reason, intellect, and prosaic realism. The Romantics believed, as Baura puts it, that the creative imagination should be closely connected with a peculiar insight into an unseen order behind visible things. Their effort was, in Samuel C. Chew's words, to live constantly in the world of imagination above and beyond the sensuous phenomenal world. For them, the creations of imagination were forms more real than living men. The part that imagination plays in the poetry of Coleridge is too obvious to need any elaboration. The writer of Kubla Khan, the Ancient Mariner, and Christabel answered well his own description of the ideal poet. Quote, "His flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise." Shelley himself would have been envious of such a romantic poet. Dorothy Wordsworth wrote about Coleridge, "He has more of the poetic eye in fine frenzy rolling than I ever witnessed." Swinburne compared him to those footless birds of paradise which spend all their lives in perpetual flight and subsist only on falling dew. While in his creative work, Coleridge worked with his teeming but delicate imagination tempered by an unerring artistic sense. In his criticism, he made a strong plea for the imaginative freedom of the poet. In his Biographia Literaria, he gave an authoritative definition of the nature and function of imagination. In putting a special stress on imagination as against dry rationalism, Coleridge emerged as a true representative of the Romantic movement in England. Love of the far. The poet who lives constantly in a world of pure imagination naturally becomes amorous of the far, both in point of time and space. He seeks an escape from the humdrum realities of familiar experience and from the limitations of that shadow show called reality. Coleridge, too, more than most romantic poets, loves to treat of the unreal or the unusual. The unreal, which is generally the highly imaginative or the supernatural, is what is never experienced, and the unusual is that which is not often experienced. According to a critic, the most characteristic feature of romantic poetry is its description or suggestion of the unreal, the light that never was on sea or land. It will be admitted that in such descriptions and suggestions, Coleridge particularly excels. How extraordinary and extraordinarily well wrought the picture of Kubla Khan's pleasure dome is. It was a miracle of strange device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. How unusual the scenes at the pole and the equator are in the Ancient Mariner. This is the picture of the pole. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noise in a swound, and this of a terrific tempest, like waters shot from stone-high crag. The lightning fell with never a jag, and rivers deep and wide. End of page 201, now page 202. In Kubla Khan, Coleridge makes mention of an Abyssinian maid and Mount Abora, etc. Thus, Coleridge is very representative romantic poet in that he loves the remote, the strange and the mysterious rather than the immediate, the commonplace and the probable. A critic observes in this connection his peculiar quality as a poet lay in his power of visualizing scenes of which neither he nor another had actual experience. As such, Coleridge's poetry fits well Pater's interpretation of Romanticism as the addition of strangeness to beauty, and Theodore Watts Dunton's interpretation of the same as the Renaissance of wonder. Supernaturalism, the love of the unreal and the remote, takes Coleridge too often in the fairy realm of the supernatural. He too often sings of the magic casement opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. His contribution to the Renaissance of wonder, Renaissance, Renaissance of wonder, is the most substantial of all English romantic poets. In his company, we visit the enchanted palace of Kubla Khan, the vampire-haunted castle of Christabel, and the demon-infested seas of the Ancient Mariner. His supernatural, however, is not the crude Gothicism of some of his predecessors, which was nothing more than the product of a ghoulish fancy, ghoulish, Goulish. His treatment of the supernatural is all his own, delicate, refined, suggestive, and psychologically convincing. Wordsworth sought to save nature from the crudity and insipidity of Crabbe by touching reality with imagination. Coleridge redeemed romance from the crudity of Gothic sensationalist by linking it with reality, whereas Wordsworth tried to supernaturalize naturalism. Coleridge endeavored quite admirably to naturalize supernaturalism. Such lines as the following are unmatched in the whole range of English literature for their richly romantic connotations. Quote, "A savage place as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover." Truly does a critic say about these lines that they are magic pure and simple. The rest is poetry. The romantic poets like Scott and Keats also dealt with the supernatural, but the supernatural is, according to a critic, the main region of his song. Moreover, his delicate psychological and artistic treatment also distinguishes him from other romantic poets. His aim was always to produce that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. In the Ancient Mariner, he achieved his aim quite creditably by focusing the attention of the reader on the shifting states of the mariner's psyche rather than any supernatural claptrap of the Gothic kind. The theme in Christabel is of the same nature as in the Ancient Mariner, but it is handled with more artistry. Here the touches of the supernatural are more subtle and less explicit. The indirectness with which these touches are made to work their cumulative effect may be contrasted with the directness of the method employed by Keats in his treatment of a like theme, the transformation of a serpent into a woman in Lamia. Medievalism. Coleridge's love of the remote, the mysterious, the strange, and the supernatural induced in him an interest for the Middle Ages. The Romantic poet, as we have already said, is impatient of the real and the earth-bound. He is very often dissatisfied with the present setup of things. Shelley, Keats, and Scott are notably so. The Romantic poet either sings of the glorious past or projects his imagination into the womb of futurity to raise a shape that answers his own desires. Thus Keats sings of the glory that was Greece. Scott endeavors to recapture the splendor of the Middle Ages, and Shelley sings of the golden age to come. Indeed, the Romantic poets look before and after and pine for what is not. Thus, to some romantics, the Middle Ages provide a comfortable spiritual home, remote and vague and mysterious. They glorify their splendor and the chivalry, but forget their dirt, disease and ignorance and social repression. They escape not only from the real world but also from the Middle Ages, real Middle Ages. The Middle Ages do not provide a spiritual home for Coleridge as they do for Scott. He values them not because of themselves but because of the excellent setting they provide for his supernatural poems. He keeps the medieval atmosphere quite vague and, unlike Keats, does not come down to the description of details. He recreates not indeed the body but the authentic spirit of the Middle Ages. Anti-intellectualism and love of nature. Coleridge, like most other romantics, was influenced by the Rousseauistic creed embodied in the slogan, "Return to Nature." End of page 202, now page 203. He was also appreciably influenced by Wordsworth, the high priest of nature. Early 18th century poetry had been drawing room poetry, having little to do with the sights and sounds of nature. Wordsworth and Coleridge demolished the age-old prejudice and brought nature to the fore. Like Wordsworth, Coleridge had been a keen eye and a clear ear for the sights and sounds of nature. He brought to his study of nature that minuteness of analysis which is surpassed in English literature only by Keats. As Vaughan points out, Coleridge had the faculty of minute and subtle observation, which he may have learned in the first instance from Wordsworth, but which he fostered to a degree of delicacy to which neither Wordsworth himself nor perhaps any other worshipper of nature, Keats excepted, were ever quite attained. This faculty, however, did not bar the way to an equal mastery of broad general effects. In his early poems, such as The Frost at Midnight, Coleridge shared Wordsworth's attitude to nature. He regarded nature as a sentient spirit and believed in its moral and educative influence on man. But later he modified this attitude and came to believe that we interpret the moods of nature according to our own moods, the pathetic fallacy of Ruskin. Nature, he came to hold, has no intrinsic moods or life of her own. She only gives us back what we give her in the first instance. O Lady, we receive but what we give, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is her wedding garment, ours her shroud. Humanitarianism. Like Wordsworth again, Coleridge came under the influence of the French Revolution. Like him, he went wild over the fall of the Bastille, which signalized for him the ushering in of a new era of emancipation from all political tyranny and the establishment of social justice. However, the reign of terror and the emergence of Napoleon after the political phase of the revolution filled both Wordsworth and Coleridge with despair and disillusionment, and brought them reeling into the fold of Toryism. Whereas Wordsworth sought refuge and consolation in nature, Coleridge went to abstruse philosophy. Nevertheless, the note of the love of humanity sounds as clearly in Coleridge's poetry as it does in Wordsworth. In this humanitarianism and enthusiasm, though temporary, for the spirit of the French Revolution, Coleridge is pretty representative poet of the Romantic age. His metrical art. In his rejection of the heroic couplet also, Coleridge represents the body of the Romantic poets, all of whom reverted to the verse measures before Dryden, as also invented some of their own. The Ancient Mariner is couched in ballad stanzas. In Christabel, he felt he had used an entirely new principle of prosody. The meter in this poem, according to him, is not, properly speaking, irregular, though it may seem so from its being founded on a new principle, namely that of counting in each line the accents, not the syllables. What is true of the Christabel is also true of Kubla Khan. The principle was definitely not new. However, Coleridge's masterful employment of it is very striking. Mention must also be made of Coleridge's skill at creating exquisite music. He, says a critic, is a singer always, as Wordsworth is not always and Byron almost never. He has been rightly called an epicure in sound. Simons says, Coleridge shows a greater sensitiveness to music than any other English poet except Milton. Shelley, you feel, sings like a bird. Blake, like a bird, like a child or an angel. But Coleridge certainly writes music. Romantic poetry has an edge over neoclassical poetry in its creation of variegated musical effects. It did not content itself with the sing-song of the heroic couplet. Thus, Coleridge is here too a representative romantic poet. The defects of Romanticism. Coleridge represents not only all the excellent features of Romanticism, but also its perils, which are chiefly three. First, he runs the constant danger of losing contact with life and reality, and getting lost in the pretty world of his own making. Thus, his poetry does not always remain a serious criticism of life. Secondly, eschewing all tradition, he, like Wordsworth, saw a decline in his poetic faculty after he had written his masterpieces. The romantic poet depends entirely on his own inspiration, which is notoriously untrustworthy. When that goes, he cannot borrow strength from the established tradition which he has disowned. This happened with Coleridge. Thirdly, he often incurs the charge of vagueness. He is too fond of color and sweet sound and sometimes sacrifices the sense to them. Words like dulcimer, honeydew, and Abyssinian maid have musical or exotic sounds, but their real meaning is not so pleasant. End of page 203. Now page 204. Robert Southey, 1774 to 1843. Closely associated with Wordsworth and Coleridge is Robert Southey, Southey, and the three, on account of their residence in the Northern Lake District, were referred to contemptuously as the Lakers by the Scottish magazine reviewers. Southey holds his place in this group more by personal association than by his literary gifts. He was born at Bristol in 1774, studied at Westminster School and at Oxford, where he found himself in perpetual conflict with the authorities on account of his independent views. He finally left the university and joined Coleridge in his scheme of a pantistocracy. For more than 50 years he labored steadily at literature, refusing to consider any other occupation. He considered himself seriously as one of the greatest writers of the day, and a reading of his ballads, which connected him at once with the Romantic school, leads us to think that had he written less, he might possibly have justified his own opinion of himself. Unfortunately, he could not wait for inspiration, being obliged to support not only his own family but also in large measure that of his friend Coleridge. Southey gradually surrounded himself with one of the most extensive libraries in the world, in England, and set himself to the task of writing something every working day. The results of his industry were 109 volumes, besides some 150 articles for the magazines, most of which are now utterly forgotten. The most ambitious poems are Thalaba, a tale of Arabian enchantment; The Curse of Kehama, a medley of Hindu mythology; Madoc, a legend of a Welsh prince who discovered the Western world; and Roderick, a tale of the last of the Goths. All these and many more, although containing some excellent passages, are on the whole exaggerated and unreal, both in manner and in matter. Southey wrote far better prose than poetry, and his admirable life of Nelson is still often read. Besides these, the lives of British admirals, his lives of Cowper and Wesley, and his histories of Brazil and of the Peninsular War. Southey was made Poet Laureate in 1813 and was first to raise that office from the low estate into which it had fallen since the death of Dryden. The opening lines of Thalaba begins. How beautiful is night, a dewy freshness fills the silent air, are still sometimes quoted, and a few of his best known poems like The Scholar, Old Clothes, The Well of St. Keen, The Inchcape Rock, and Lodore will repay the curious reader. The beauty of Southey's character, his patience and helpfulness, made him a worthy associate of the two greater poets with whom he is generally named.